Hey guys, it's Jasma, and today we're going to make raspberry Valentine's Day macarons. These are going to be in little heart shapes and sandwiched with a raspberry buttercream filling. This is one of my favorite combinations because the raspberry is a little bit tart, which means it's a little sour, so it perfectly balances out the sweetness of the entire macaron. This would be perfect for Valentine's Day, so let's get started. First, we're going to make the Macaron Shells, and this is just a simple, basic macaron recipe. We have the ground almonds. This is also known as almond flour or almond meal. And I'm going to pour it into a sieve. It is very important that you always pass the almond meal through a sieve. And also add in the icing sugar. I'm going to mix this together and just pass it through a sieve. If you made macarons before, you would know you would always want to pass the dry ingredients through a sieve because you don't want any coarse almond lumps inside of the final batter since it would give it a rough finish. I passed all of my dry ingredients through a sieve so I can move on to the meringue. The meringue is basically the egg whites beaten with white sugar. I'm going to be using my stand mixer today as always. You could of course use your hand mixer or attempt to do this by hand. I'm using a whisk attachment, and make sure that when you're beating meringue of any sort, you want to have your bowl nice and clean. There should be no water in here and no grease or anything at all, because if there is, then the egg whites wouldn't whip up. I've already separated my egg whites. This is about 1.5. And you want to make sure you do not get any yolks in here either, because again, that would affect how the egg whites whip up. Add the egg whites to the clean bowl and start whipping until frothy. As it starts to turn white, we're going to add in 1/3 of the white sugar. We're adding in the sugar in 3 stages, so make sure you don't dump it in all at once. Continue beating. Once you could start to see the tracks of the beater inside of the egg whites, you can see it has started to thicken up a lot. So this is when we add in our second stage of sugar. As soft peaks form, you could add in the last stage of sugar. Continue beating for a little more, just until the sugar disappears. The egg white is now nice and glossy and very thick. It has also grew in volume, so I'm going to scrape down the sides of the bowl to make sure that all the sugar granules that has escaped goes back in the meringue. Now we can add the food coloring into the meringue. Today I'm going to be using some red gel food coloring from Wilton, and I have tried many alternatives such as raspberry puree, but it doesn't seem to work in a macaron batter because it needs a very specific type of consistency, and adding anything else that is too liquidy will change that and the macarons won't come out as well. So I found that the gel food coloring works the best. You can also attempt powdered food coloring. I'm going to start off by adding in a little bit, but just know that this does lighten up while it bakes in the oven, so always make the color a little bit darker than you want it to come out as. I'm going to add it in with a toothpick to make sure that I don't add too much at once. I'm going to add a little bit more. Of course, you can add as much or as little as you want. I got the color that I wanted, and my meringue is now at stiff peaks. That means it could stand up all on its own, like so. And you should also be able to flip the bowl upside down and nothing should fall out. Add all the meringue into the dry ingredients, and at first you don't have to be too careful with it. Just fold it until the dry ingredients are mixed in with the egg whites and there are no dry bits left. Then we're going to start the folding process and deflating the egg whites until it is at the right consistency. You are trying to deflate the egg whites, but do not overmix it or it will become a very runny puddle of batter and you wouldn't be able to pipe it into any shape macaron. Now it is important that you reach the right consistency. So as you start seeing the batter becoming a little more runny, just take the spatula, lift up some batter and allow it to fall back into the rest of the bowl. If it forms a ribbon as it falls and it disappears back into the rest of the batter in 10 to 15 seconds, that means it is ready. We can now shape and bake the macarons. So you want to make sure that you have a baking tray lined with some parchment paper. And today, since we are making heart-shaped macarons, I printed out a heart-shaped template and I'm going to lay it on the bottom. We will remove this before we bake it and then place the parchment paper on top. Now I printed mine out, or you can also hand draw it onto a sheet of paper, or you could just freehand it and not use a template at all. Just make sure that the lines you use are nice and dark so you can see it through the parchment paper. I would suggest you to use a template for this because heart shapes are a little bit harder to control than circles when it comes to piping. Just going to set this aside. You want to get this ready ahead of time. Meanwhile, I have a piping bag and I fitted it with a nice round tip. Make sure it's not too big because you want to be able to control it. And I would suggest you to use a round tip. You can just snip off the tip of a bag, but since it's a heart shape, a round tip would guide you a lot easier. When you're getting ready to fill a bag, you want to snip off the tip, place in the tip, and then while your hand is still in there, you want to twist the tip and then make it face up, then put it into a tall cup. This helps you fill it without it leaking out in the bottom. Pour your macaron batter into your prepared piping bag. Once all of the batter has been piped out, I'm going to bang this on the counter a couple of times to release any extra air bubbles. Now I'm going to carefully remove the paper template on the bottom. Try not to disturb the macarons. Now set this aside somewhere for it to dry out and form a skin on top. And once again, if you've never made macarons before, I would suggest you go check out the videos I filmed before on making macarons because I would explain it a lot more detailedly there. We're going to wait for it to form a skin on top. This is what's going to give it the feet. And the time will vary for you depending on where you're putting it. If you put it somewhere dry, it would take a little bit less time. But if it's somewhere that is a little humid, then it would take longer. Meanwhile, you want to preheat your oven to 300 degrees Fahrenheit while this dries out. The macaron shells is now dried and formed a skin on top, and you really want to make sure that you wait for it to dry out. Do not just throw it in as soon as you're done piping it, because it would not form the feet that makes it look like a macaron. Now to make sure it is ready, I'm just going to test it by just tapping it with my finger, and if nothing sticks, that means it is dry. And you should look down at it and it doesn't seem shiny. It should be a matte finish. Now this only took the amount of time that it took my oven to preheat, which is around 15 minutes. But again, your time will vary depending on where you put it. So now I'm going to place this into the oven for around 10 to 12 minutes. Make sure you keep an eye on it and do not open the oven midway. My macarons has baked for 11 minutes in the oven at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And to see if it is completely cooked, you should just be able to carefully lift it off of the baking tray and nothing should stick. So now I'm just going to let this cool completely while I work on the filling. Now we're going to make the raspberry buttercream filling. I have some defrosted frozen raspberries. You could also use fresh raspberries. It doesn't make that big a difference. And I'm going to pass this through a sieve to get rid of any seeds. And all we're doing here is to get the juices out of the raspberries so we could use it to dye the buttercream and also give it the raspberry flavor. And I like to use fresh raspberries instead of food coloring to dye the buttercream because it not only gives it a very vibrant and natural color, it also gives the buttercream a sort of sweet and sour flavor, which really balances out the macaron. If your raspberries are really hard to mash through the sieve, you can microwave it a little bit, which softens it up. We now have the raspberry puree ready to go, so we can move on to making the buttercream. I have some softened unsalted butter ready to go, and I'm going to be using my stand mixer today. You can of course use a hand mixer if you want to, and I'm using a whisk attachment. I'm just going to add my butter into the bowl. It really should be nice and soft or it's going to be quite difficult to beat. And we're just going to start off by creaming this. Beat for about 2 minutes until it becomes pale in color. It's not a lot of butter because we're not going to be needing too much of this filling. Alright, the butter has become practically white in color. I'm just going to scrape the bowl one more time. Alright, now I'm going to add in the icing sugar. Mix the sugar into the butter, starting low. And now I'm going to add in the raspberry puree, starting with a spoonful, and you can add as much or as little as you want, just until you get the right color. Our raspberry buttercream is now ready to go. The frosting is now ready, so I'm going to load it into a Ziploc bag. There's not a lot of frosting, so I don't find the need to use an actual piping bag. If you like a lot of frosting inside of your macarons, you could double this recipe, but this is usually just how much I use. The frosting should be really nice and fluffy, and it should have grown in volume as well. My macarons here baked and cooled, and I matched them up by the size and the shape. And I'm going to fill it with the raspberry buttercream that we just made. Snip off a small tip off of the bag. I sandwiched together my macarons, so now we're going to do the final step and decorate them by painting on some flowers with food coloring. I'm going to be using gel food coloring today. You can also use liquid food coloring, but since I'm using gel food coloring, I'm going to be diluting it with some almond extract. I'm using almond extract because it's an alcohol-based extract, so it evaporates a lot faster. You can also use lemon extract or anything that is clear. I chose to use lemon yellow, red, and juniper green today because I can mix them together to make a variety of different colors, and they also work pretty well with my macarons since I dyed them pink. Now you can choose to leave your macarons white, so you can paint on whatever colors you like. And I'm also going to be using a pastry brush. This is a paintbrush especially for food. Don't use paintbrushes that you've touched paint before because that's just not very sanitary. It has a very fine tip, and it's going to be very useful when we're drawing these roses. You can find this in any craft store or baking store. Just find a paintbrush the size that you feel like would work. You could also choose to pipe your macarons a lot bigger so that it would make it easier to paint on. I prepared a little bit of water to just clean off my brush in between each take. And now we could start to paint these macarons. Onto a plate, I'm going to scoop on a little bit of my gel food coloring. Now, gel food coloring is a lot more concentrated than liquid food coloring, so I like to use this. I'm only going to be using 3 basic colors so that I can mix them together and create more colors later on. Now pour the almond extract into another little bowl. Now we can start to paint the macarons. The less almond extract you add, the less diluted the paint would be. That means more opaque, so it would show up darker on top of the macarons. So you could just control how thick or how thin you want your paint to be by adding more or less almond extract. If you want to darken the red color, you could add a little bit of juniper green to it, and it turns it sort of into a brownish color. That's how you make these adorable raspberry macarons. The painting part, of course, is optional, but it adds so much to these macarons. You can wrap them up in a little bag and give it to your friends and family as a perfect little Valentine's Day treat. They sure are impressive and very tasty as well. The raspberry filling perfectly balances out the sweetness of the entire macaron, which is why I love the raspberry flavor. And if you're interested in making more macarons, you should go check out my previous macaron videos. I will leave a link in the description down below. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, leave a comment, and give it a like if you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and see you guys next time. Bye!